There are a lot of things I want to talk about on this channel. And strangely, the channel has got started off with a conflict with another person. And I know I don't have many followers right now, but I've had other YouTube channels before that grew over time into a lot of followers. I even had a YouTube channel that got shut down years ago. And so this one follower that I had a conversation with, he doesn't want his name used, but I had multiple conversations with him and wanted to meet in person to discuss some of these issues, because this is a person who believes that feminism is one of the most destructive forces. And what I started thinking about is how maybe I've started this channel off on the wrong foot by talking about dismantling patriarchy. It seems to have raised some hackles. And, naturally, if someone feels attacked, someone who's a male, if there's any suggestion, even though there's so much not only historical evidence, but believe me, if you're a woman, plenty of experiential evidence for why patriarchy needs to be dismantled in order for men and women to overcome the divide, and in order for, in other words, for men and women to start treating each other like family again. In other words, for men and women to start belonging to each other again. In order for that to happen, first people have to belong to themselves. And I think if we observe patterns of abuse, whether we're calling that patriarchy or just abuse, since women can also abuse, part of the problem with abuse, especially if it's just either within your own family, with someone you're partnered with, someone you have children with, or even just someone who's part of the human family, abuse is a denial of that other person's belonging. So I'm framing this conversation mostly in terms of how, family constellation therapy would look at abuse as being contrary to the orders of love. Now, the orders of love are, I've already mentioned, they're not moral. They are functional. And the function of the orders of love is not just so love can flow, but so that love can grow. So they're principles of growth. And obviously abuse from anyone to anyone or anything, is counter to that. Even though also naturally in, the natural polarity of growth and death, there will be that polarity of breaking down and building up. There will be opposites that arise in this universe, right? But when it comes to family lineage or the family of humankind, in terms of the ability to actually grow rather than degenerate, and rather than recede or essentially go down to a lower level of functioning, in order to prevent that from happening, we have to belong. We have to know that we belong. And hierarchical systems of abuse, at least the ones that are based in valuing certain people over others, which is really only possible to do when someone is dependent on another, those hierarchical systems are counter to the laws of love. They are counter to belonging, because when people are slaves through dependency, not only are they not treated as belonging to the family, but they're also technically don't belong to themselves. In other words, this is just another way of talking about human beings as property, whether that's a woman or land. And we know this goes way back to the advent of agriculture. So these are extremely deep-seated patterns. The built-in dependency that women have on men, which it is not easy to not abuse a dependency. For example, could we ask mothers in the dependency that children have on them, whether they have been impeccable in the power imbalance that occurs? I mean, no mother has been impeccable in that, in the same way that very few men can be impeccable in the power imbalance that occurs when a woman has a child and is dependent on him. So dependency is a structural, functional issue that you could say is based in biology. that more patriarchal systems utilize as a means to justify abuse, because that dependency is inevitable to the extent that women receive and become vulnerable to the act of sex. And yet a healthy hierarchy, as I've already mentioned, would be one in which the love flows in both directions. This would follow the law of balance. In other words, the law of reciprocity, that is something that Hellinger outlines in his Laws of Love in the book Love's Hidden Symmetry. So these cats are listening to this. So I think what I'm realizing is that the feminist rejection of hierarchy and the patriarchal abuse of hierarchy, which has been coupled with the capitalistic abuse of hierarchy, and capitalism and patriarchy needing each other to do this, is actually inaccurate in the sense that hierarchy is not inherently abusive. Hierarchy describes a functional, structural, whole systems ordering of different people in different roles according to function, so that a system can function. And that system becomes dysfunctional when the energy doesn't flow both ways. In other words, is not balanced or reciprocal. And that's why that's one of the 3 laws of Hellinger, which I outlined in the last video, the 3 laws of love outlined by Hellinger. The law of balance, the law of belonging, and the law of hierarchy. Not a hierarchy of value, a hierarchy of precedence and a hierarchy of need. So watch previous videos if you want to look into that. So what I'm realizing is that, language is very tricky. When we say hierarchy, most people assume a hierarchy is a hierarchy of power and value. And there are many hierarchies that describe structural coherence. The whole goal of a hierarchy is to create a structure that creates coherence for a certain means or ends. And hierarchical structures that are oppressive usually have the means or ends of accumulation of wealth, greed, power, but there could be other hierarchies, right? If we look at nature and we look at, like I've been thinking about water, the structure of water, coherent structures are ordered in iterations of scale. Whether you're looking at a snowflake or structured water within the cell, or you're looking at a coherent family system, the coherency of the structure, which is ordered at levels of scale, in other words, at levels of hierarchy, is what determines how resilient a system is, how able it is to handle stress, how able it is to handle new information and to coherently integrate and adapt to that. So that's why any system, whether we call it patriarchy or whatever we call it, any system that's based in abuse it's not going to be fulfilling while it's happening for everyone. And in that sense, it's already incoherent. It's unsustainable in the sense that there will be a natural resistance to any kind of structural system that rejects or exiles any particular member of the family. So in the case of women were systematically rejected as being seen as fully human, and therefore as belonging to the family, and therefore as even belonging to themselves. You could also see slavery in that same way. So instead of just dwelling in the difficulty of this very traumatic history that has occurred and the backlash that has occurred against it, that has been a vibrational match. So you could see that the so-called toxic forms of feminism that many men reject is a vibrational match to the toxic forms of patriarchy, and is a very natural consequence of self-assertion. The amount of anger, which some could feel is toxic, is certainly proportionate to the amount of abuse that has occurred, and is a form of self-assertion. And I think what's happening is that some men are mistaking feminism for misandry, and many women are mistaking patriarchy for misogyny. So we shouldn't be talking about feminism and patriarchy, I don't think, if we really want to look at the problems inherent in the abuses that have occurred, but rather to look at misandry and misogyny. Look at the male hatred of the feminine and the female hatred of the masculine. which does not necessarily have anything to do with feminism or patriarchy. A healthy form of patriarchy actually adores and cherishes the feminine. And a healthy form of feminism is simply a form of self-belonging, self-adoration, and self-cherishing, and a form of self-assertion of basic humanity, basic human belonging to the family of people who deserve to be treated with respect as kin. So, yeah, I really want to start looking. I think that the language we use in these discussions is very important. And if we're using common language that people have a lot of different associations with, we need to go into the nuances of that terminology. And we also need to dare ourselves to broaden the conversation to extend beyond using the language that so many people are triggered by, right? So I would say, instead of dismantling patriarchy, the new language that I will use is the project of seeking to reinstate kinship. And this kinship doesn't have to be a bloodline kinship. It doesn't have to be the kinship of fate, as Hellinger has spelled out, between blood family, but rather the family of humanity. We could say that this is the kinship project. We are not dismantling patriarchy. We are reestablishing kinship, right? And along those lines, we will not conflate feminism with misandry or hatred of men, and we will not conflate patriarchy with hatred of women, right? So I am not here to dismantle patriarchy. I am here to be brutally honest about the real repercussions of hatred of women as embedded within a system of dependency and therefore an easier abuse of power. Now, women have abused their power as well. I would argue that the abuse of power that women can impose in an abusive way is more towards children than towards men, because the children are dependent on the women, right? On their mothers. And so a lot of trauma and a lot of power abuse or attachment wounds can occur by way of how the mother has behaved. And a lot of how she behaves will be a direct reflection of the degree of power and agency she feels in her life, how well regulated she is by the stability of the man that's in her life. In other words, to what degree the man and her husband, the father of her children, is embodying a healthy form of patriarchy that creates a nurturing and safe holding field for her nervous system to feel safe and regulated, so that she doesn't have to be a tyrant with the child. However, if the man doesn't provide that, will she become a tyrant? Yes, she will become a tyrant, as those who hurt people tend to be those who have been hurt, right? Hurt people hurt people. If she is hurt by the way she has been rejected as a human, the way she has not been treated with respect, she will very naturally become extraordinarily angry and resentful. And to the man who did not provide the holding field, and she will act out, often in a very immature way. The low vibrational energy matching the low vibrational energy. And she may become a tyrant. And the easiest way for women to become tyrants, since there are other forms of power that are not as easily accessible to them, the easiest way is for them to be verbally abusive. So this with Terrence Real's framework of the boundaryless and one up, that will normally occur, and this is how I've experienced it, as an enormous amount of words and talking down upon someone, looking down upon someone. And I mean, just in full honesty, because this channel really should be about honesty, I so appreciate Terrence Real's ability to point this out, that while patriarchal abuse of women and men's abuse of women can take certain forms, since they are physically stronger and tend to have more financial power, women's form of entitlement and boundarylessness often takes the form of verbal abuse or lecturing. And lecturing is when you're talking down to your husband as though he were a child, which is out of order in the laws of love of Hellinger's work. Because if you are treating an equal as a child, then that is out of order in the order of hierarchy. So I think that when I examine the laws of love and the orders of law, the orders of love, which are orders of growth, in other words, they are the behaviors if we align to them, that allow us to grow in the family soul, then I see that of these 3 laws and orders, the one that I have violated, and I see it as an extremely natural consequence of abusive conditions. I'm not saying this is justified. I'm saying that it's natural, and to the extent that it's largely unconscious and unclear what other way to get through to a man, women end up becoming tyrannical abusers in this way, in the way that they talk down to men and look down to men. And I'm just being utterly and completely honest here. I'm not proud of this, but I will say that the ways that my ex-husband abused the 3 laws of love, of belonging, hierarchy, in other words, not showing that I had rank, and excluding me, in other words, not allowing me to belong in my own family, by way of unconscious loyalties that he had. Actually, the biggest unconscious loyalty being to his own family's dysfunction. So we have to understand that if you grow up in a dysfunctional family, the way to belong in it is to be dysfunctional. So if you're going to give up belonging in that family by being functional, that's a threat to your identity. It's also a form of disloyalty to your family, to be functional, to be happier than your parents were. So in light of the violation of these 3 laws of love that I was not aware of when I was married, I think it's very natural that I and other women would become incensed and actually would very much look down upon their husbands for abusing these 3 laws, which are intuitive. Even if you aren't familiar with Hellinger's work and you aren't aware of what those 3 laws are, the law of hierarchy, belonging, and balance. If you are living in a partnership in which all 3 are being constantly violated, it's very difficult not to look down upon the person that you're married to who's doing that. And there are infinite ways that this can be done, subtly and not so subtly, throughout a marriage. If someone is dependent on you financially because they had children with you, it's very easy to abuse these. And if it's part of a long family tradition of doing so, or a cultural tradition of patriarchy, it's extremely easy to do so. So this is all just an example of how, I don't want to say patriarchy, because remember, we're trying to rehabilitate patriarchy and remove it from misogyny. So how unconscious misogynistic programming that arose from women's dependency on men, and the hatred and anger that occurs in women because of that, and the inherent rejection and resistance that women will feel and have felt throughout history. If you add on to that the sheer amount of trauma of both men and women, not only, the extraordinary amount of violence that women have collectively withstood, but the extraordinary amount of violence that men have collectively withstood. The fact that we are resilient people who come from long lines of people who have gone through harrowing experiences historically. It's amazing we don't have more self-respect or respect for each other, or more value placed in the integrity of the family system. So it's all very understandable how these things happen. The question is, what are we going to do now from this place? From this place of quite a bit of trauma, quite a bit of discord, quite a bit of polarization, quite a bit of hatred. Also quite a bit of self-hatred. People who abuse other people do so because they don't have self-respect. It's a bit of a mess right now. It's a bit of a mess. And yet there's nothing better than a big mess to wake us up to our deep inner core and what it is that we truly deeply long for and desire and know is possible. And we don't want to be unrealistic in pitting our hopes on something that's unrealistic, but I think that it starts with self-value. If it is realistic to learn to belong to ourselves and the value of ourselves, we can be an anchor point for a healthy form of attachment that then allows one another to feel safe. And I think a healthy form of attachment can really only occur between men and women in the face of being able to face the amount of abuse that has occurred and be honest about that, and also show our animal selves and how angry we are about that, and still know that those who are our kin and our family are able to withstand the honesty and truth of that without collapsing, without avoidance, without resorting to polarization, in order to stand firm in the integrity of the family, which originates in the sense of personal self-value that a person knows of their own inner integrity, which occurs through self-honoring and belonging to oneself. When we do this, we have the stability within ourselves to be able to be present with another person's anger, another person's trauma, another person's accusations, without overly internalizing or personalizing it, and really showing up with compassion for understanding that these forms of polarization and hatred come from deep wounds and deep traumas that are generations old. And that if we want to be family again, we have to be able to stand firm in presence, in love, which we can only do if we're fully anchored in our own value and our own sense of belonging to ourselves. We do not need to have allegiances or loyalties to dysfunctional systems, whether that's misogynistic systems, and notice that I didn't say patriarchal systems, whether that's misogynistic systems or just whatever the kind of run-of-the-mill garden variety trauma is that you inherited from your family. So now that I've kind of waded my way through some of the shit that inevitably is our inheritance, these encrusted layers of resentment, resistance, polarization that I think have kind of accumulated, at least in those of us who are very sensitive, in an understanding of ancestral trauma bonds, ancestral trauma loyalties, ancestral trauma patterns of discord between the masculine and feminine that need to be broken. These layers, I actually had a vision, these layers of encrusted shit can actually fall away, and we can find what is underneath them. The amount of anger and the amount of discord and conflict that occurs reveals how deeply hurt we are, which means that we deeply care. If we were not this dysfunctional through our pain, it would mean that we didn't care. And so, yeah, what they say, what is that saying? The opposite of love is not hatred, it's apathy. So if you're angry and you're mad at women and how tyrannical they are, or if you're a woman who's angry and mad at how tyrannical men have been, whether that's overt, obvious abuse and tyranny, or the garden variety form of tyranny that is built into a system of entitlement that men benefit from unconsciously, if you're angry about any of the iterations of that, you are because you care. You're angry because you care. You're angry because you want your family back. And that's a good sign. So, cheers to your anger.